Be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. So I think one of the interesting things to kind of look at is right now we're in the midst of what is the worst offensive start to a baseball season in Major League Baseball history. Hitters are hitting for, I think, the worst collective average they've ever hit for so far at this point of the season. And part of that is that you're looking at the game has evolved, the pitchers have gotten better, they use more of them, and then you have the defensive shift has come in that has taken away a lot of the intermediary hits. So you see guys going for just, well, I'll just hit it over them. Nobody can shift on me if I just hit it out of the ballpark. But I think one of the things you're going to lose because of this is the 200 hit season.
I like to do, we do a trivia thing on Tuesdays. And so this week, in trying to tease out this episode, I came up with a trivia question. I have to admit, I got it wrong. And the reason I got it wrong is I took the information from this MajorLeagueBaseball.com site, MLB.com, and it was wrong. So the question I posed is who was the last player since in 2009? Derek Jeter had over 200 hits, and I'll think of the other player. Two guys had over 200 hits that year. That was the last time it happened. Only one time since, I thought, in 2014, did another player get 200 hits. Okay. And so I posed the question. I went on the Sabres site and I put it on there. And the guys are like, I don't understand. And I'm like, well, what do you mean you don't understand? These guys are like, I don't understand what your point is. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? It's simply the only guy. He goes, but Whit Merrifield had 200 hits in 2019 and so did Rafael Devers. And I'm like, what? And so I left the Major League Baseball site and I went to baseballreference.com. Sure enough.
So even on the Major League website, they didn't have this correct.
The moral of the story is don't use MLB.com as your source, apparently. And I was teased by a couple of the guys in Sabre about, yeah, of course you don't use that as a site, which is just really kind of embarrassing. So the point is that the two guys did it in the last full season. So I would have agreed with you to start that thought process going, okay, with the shift and all that, are you not going to get there?
But guys can get there.
But guys can get there. And so that surprised me, actually, because I was about to make this grand point that it hasn't happened in 7 years. And that's not the case.
But I think it still shows that it is an endangered species.
Right, because it didn't happen from 2014 to 2019, so 5 straight years. And that's about the longest stretch that I saw.
And certainly right now, it doesn't look like it's going to happen this year.
Not in this season. And you mentioned, the poor offense this year. And I heard a joke today. Pitchers are hitting a collective 105 this year in the major leagues. And Matt Carpenter of the St. Louis Cardinals is hitting 111. So the posed question was, who will end up with a better average this season, Matt Carpenter or
the
pitchers
collective pitchers? I would assume Matt Carpenter, and I think certainly both we and the Cardinals are hoping so.
And the guy hit two home runs in the game, right? Yanoa has 2 home runs this year, which hasn't happened in a long, long time that a pitcher hit. And again, those are just outlier performances. So, yeah, is 200 hits an endangered species? I think it's going to happen more infrequently, as we've already seen.
And I mean, it makes sense just because of the way that the game has evolved, but also just because defense has gotten better.
Right. Actually, it's an interesting point because I think about that in the context of games like hockey and basketball. Right, in basketball, you've got the court is still 94 feet long in basketball, right? But the players are so much bigger and they can stride to midcourt, it seems, in 2 or 3 strides. There's more people occupying the same space. It's the same in baseball, not as dramatic as the field is bigger.
But it's not like the field dimensions have changed drastically since 1900, I would imagine, for the most part. And if anything, they've gotten smaller.
Well, actually, the hockey would count there because not every rink is the same size, or that was one of the things about the NHL for years, believe it or not, that some rinks had a little bit. Well, baseball is the only other major sport that has different dimensions in the stadium depending on
where they
made the stadium, and why they had to do it, and they're conscious. And in the new City Field they put in 2009, they put these little nooks and crannies, and they had to make corrections because there were problems with that. The point is that they have to cover more ground, but the players are faster, bigger, and they cover more ground.
And they're better at recognizing the ball off the bat. So I think you probably get certainly less cheapy hits, like hits you probably shouldn't have gotten. It's probably way harder to get those types of hits.
Well, and not only that, you made the point, you're hitting into the shift. And, we talk about it all the time on this podcast, ground balls into right field, they get thrown out of first base. And we keep saying, hey, this is an out because the players were stationed there before the pitch was thrown. It's like it wasn't like he just miraculously appeared in right field. He was there the whole time.
He's not Bugs Bunny, like tunneling underneath the field and popping up to grab the ball. Like, he was there in his position. So, it kind of begs the question of why aren't hitters adjusting in that fashion?
And that is my whole point, that the hitters are still being paid, or they think they're being paid on the basis of power stats, home runs in particular. Mookie Betts got that $300 million contract a couple years ago. Lindor just got a $341 million contract for the Mets. Why do these guys get these big contracts? Well, not just because they're great players, that's obvious, and they play defense and they play offenses. These guys can hit for power as well as do all the other things.
So you have a guy, you have your shortstop and your center fielder in those cases who are going to hit for average, who are actually going to be able to steal some bases, play great defense, and they hit for power.
Yeah, and the Dodgers obviously have moved Betts to right field, which I think devalues him a little bit, because his contribution doing those things as a center fielder is even greater.
Correct.
So, but because they hit, Lindor, when he's going well, he's hitting 28 home runs a year, and Mookie Betts has hit more than 30 a few times. If these guys hit 15 home runs a year, and they did all the other things that they do, they wouldn't get $300 million?
They wouldn't get $300 million. That's the thing.
So this has an effect, an opinion here, that all the players have to think, okay, well, home runs are how I get the big contract. If I can have that outlier season when who was it? Joey Gallo hits 50 home runs, and all of a sudden he's a big contract
People are
player,
throwing money at
even
him.
though he hits 213.
And it certainly tells you something that when you think about it, Pete Rose valued himself as what, the $100,000 singles hitter.
Right. And
there can't be a lot of those.
No.
It's way harder to live that way than to be able to hit the ball with power.
And with all these advanced analytical stats, it's hard, and you can go and come up with runs created by hitter, right? We have stats like that and do that. It's just not yet sort of translated, at least the way that I look at it, to, hey, what are we really valuing when we value a player? The guy that hits a big home run, or the guy who consistently puts up the greatest runs created? Maybe he doesn't hit as many home runs as everybody else, but he's overall more efficient.
Well, interestingly enough, we actually had the guy that has the single season hit record who's kind of shown us that, because if you remember, there was that one season where Ichiro hit like 25 home runs.
I think he hit 28, and you're right. He said, okay, this year I'm going to hit home runs. And he hit for lower average.
But he hit more home runs, and the Mariners were like, this isn't as helpful.
And he did the same thing, going, I'm not going to do that anymore. And he just didn't do that anymore.
But that's because he's Ichiro. Because when you think about it, if you're a Major League Baseball player, what's easy? If you're going to hit 50 home runs, hitting home runs in about 10% of your at-bats over the season, or getting hits in 30% of your at-bats over the course of a season. Right. That's way harder.
So, you mentioned Ichiro, and you had a great point about Ichiro saying, I guess, that when he got into the league, what were you saying?
He came in, so one of the things is just talks about how good a hitter you have to be to get just kind of over those crazy hit numbers that a guy like Ichiro would get. As he came into the league, and in his 10th game, Ichiro's average got over 300. It never went below 300 for his career average the rest of his career.
And by the way, this is a guy we talked about who came from Japan, who had 1,500 hits in Japan and batted 300 there too.
If he had played his entire career in the major leagues, he would be the all-time hit leader. No question.
I think he's got the combined.
Record
as it stands, and he is also the leader, as with the aforementioned Pete Rose, for most seasons with 200 hits.
And I think the impressive thing about Ichiro is he did it consecutively.
They both had 10.
But Ichiro did for 10 consecutive years.
10 straight years. And that, I think the first year he came in the league, he had 200 hits, and he then did it for the next 9 after that.
Which is just sick.
So Ty Cobb has 9, and you get to some of the older names like Paul Wainer, Big Poison versus his brother Little Poison, Lloyd Wainer, who's not in this list. Lou Gehrig, which that impressed me. Lou Gehrig, he was certainly a power hitter, 475 career home runs.
But 200 hits you don't do by accident.
Wee Willie Keeler, which we talked about, his claim to fame is
hit it where they ain't.
Hit it where they ain't. We really did that.
But he also comes from what I would affectionately refer to as ancient baseball.
Yeah, well, before 1901, and I got into a discussion this week also on what modern baseball is with somebody, and it's generally accepted that because the American League started official play in 1901, that is the beginning of modern baseball. Some people say, well, the American League came from what was going on before. Look, 1901 is what most people consider, so we're just going to go with that.
Right, exactly. And especially because weren't they really not even playing in stadiums prior to that? They were like in a field more or less?
Sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
sometimes, yeah, absolutely. So Derek Jeter is on that list, and boy, the more you look at Jeter's career, he had 3,400 hits.
Yeah, like Jeter's just the type of player that for whatever reason, something about him as an opposing fan makes you want to downplay
you're a Met fan.
Yeah.
You're a Met fan, and he's a Yankee.
Well, but I'm saying like all opposing fans want to like take him down a peg to be like, no, he wasn't as good as advertised. He kind of was.
Yeah, just everything the guy did. You keep looking at it going, wow. So he wasn't an accumulator, but he had consistently good stats for a really, really long time.
I think what's interesting about Jeter though is so he did it when he first came up in 98 through 2000, and then for like 5 years he didn't do it, and then he got back to getting 200 hits again later in his career, which is unusual and I think rather interesting.
So on this list, and it goes down to players that had 5 seasons of 200 hits, including the great Tony Gwynn. Kirby Puckett had 5 seasons at 200 hits.
Stan Musial
had 6. Michael Young, a player we talked about last time, and they have to take a step back on. This guy had 6 seasons with 200 hits.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Which is why he wasn't a guy we were really considering as a utility man.
The only other guy that's on the list who is not in the Hall of Fame of guys that, well, actually not this list. He's on the
single season hit record.
Single season. So if you go down, let's change gears. So let's go with 240 hits in a season and above. 240 is a big number.
Yeah, like you don't really get there by, mistake. You're doing that because you had an unbelievable season.
And it's an exclusive club, right? You got 14 players that have had 240 hits in a season or more.
And only one person has done it twice.
And only 2 guys on this list are not in the Hall of Fame. I thought it was 1, and there's the last guy on the list, Darren Erstad of the then Anaheim Angels, right? Because he played for all the Angels teams, by the way. He played for the California Angels, the Anaheim Angels, and the LA Angels. And he had 240 hits in the year 2000. The only other guy on the list is Lefty O'Doul, who I remember had this bar in San Francisco, Lefty O'Doul's, that was a really fun place to go a long time ago. Lefty O'Doul barely played 11 years in the major leagues, but had 254 hits in 1929.
Pretty good.
Not a Hall of Famer, though. Not a Hall of Famer. Everybody else, Ichiro, George Sisler, Bill Terry, Al Simmons, Hornsby, Cobb, Klein, Sisler, Heine Manouche, also a Hall of Fame player. You may not know him as well as some of the others. Babe Herman of the Dodgers, and the great Wade Boggs. All these guys had more than 2, and that's a real dividing line. You get 240 hits, it looks to me like you're
more
kind of an all-time great player.
Probably an all-time,
except for Darren Erstad
and Lefty O'Doul.
Well, Lefty O'Doul is closer. I think it's just because he barely played 11 seasons and he just didn't have enough to qualify. So. So 200 hits, you think about it, you got 162 games. Let's say you play 150 of those games roughly in a season. So you're getting a little less than a hit and a half on average.
Which is pretty good. Like that means pretty much every time you go out there, which is probably you're hitting around 330 for the season. That's the thing. You got to hit you can't just hit 300. You got to be up there.
To get 200 hits, that's a great question. I should have dug into who has come the closest to only hitting 300 while still getting. So you would have had to have a zillion at bats.
Right. So
Lance Johnston of the Mets one year had 200, and he has the Met record for hits in a season. And I think he barely hit over 300.
But you could only get away with that if you had an absolute ton. So you probably couldn't miss any games.
Right. And maybe you didn't have a great on-base percentage, so you had more official at-bats.
Right, you probably didn't walk much.
Right. So, I think that, getting 200 hits is still a dividing line between somebody who's had a really good season and somebody who's had, an almost great season, right? 56 times a player has had exactly 200 hits in a season.
Surprised it's landed on it that much.
56 times, that's, and Randy Velarde, who I remember came up with the Yankees, was a utility player, which we talked about those kinds of players. He had 200 hits in a season, and the weird thing is he got traded in the middle of the season. So it really struck me as, how do you trade a guy who's on course for a 200 hit season? Because he must not have a lot of respect.
Yeah, because it's like you got to be hitting pretty good to be getting that many hits to like be in a position. It's not like he got traded and then proceeded to hit 500 the rest of the season.
I tried to look at like 200 hits. What would be the number of touchdown passes in the NFL that you might say would be equivalent to that kind of a category? So 518 baseball players, which has been around a lot longer than football, have had 200 hits in a season. Is it 35 touchdowns? Is it 30 touchdowns? 40 I felt was too much.
Well, interestingly, I think there's a baseball comparison that's actually rather apt. And that's RBIs in a season.
That's also true.
Because weirdly, this was something that you brought up to me, is the number of players that have had 120 or more RBIs in a season. And so it's really interesting that 515 players all time have had a season of 120 RBIs or more. And then how many players, 518 players have had 200 hits or more in a season since in that same time frame pretty much. That's interesting.
And which do you think would be more valuable? And can we even make that evaluation?
I don't think you can make that evaluation because on the surface, I would want to say RBIs. Purely from the perspective of I know runs are scoring.
Okay, now I remember you saying that RBIs are the product of the lineup around you and are overvalued.
They are overvalued, but at the same time, I think in this case, when you're comparing these two statistics against each other, I know with RBIs that means runs are scoring, whereas within a vacuum, I don't know how valuable that those 200 hits are.
And I agree with you on that point. And I think the dividing line is I wished it would have been 100 RBI seasons matched up with 200 hits. It would have been a nice round number thing.
Right, but I think if 100 you can get to kind of with compiling. You can just be in the right place in the right lineup and not have a particularly impressive season and get there. But 120...
You're not lucky if you got 120.
You're probably not getting too lucky to get up there.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference. So it's interesting to me that, that we had two players do it as recently as 2019. I don't even know who's leading the major leagues in hits right now. I know a couple of guys have gotten off to really good starts, but those guys that were hitting 400, as normally is the case early in the season, they've already kind of gone by the wayside. And to be on a pace to get 200 hits against these pitchers right now in this environment, based on what you just said about offense, I'd basically say I agree with you, and I don't think anybody's going to do it this year.
Well, right now, the major league leader in hits. Now, granted, this is according to MLB baseball, so we don't know exactly how accurate it is.
That's right.
But
consider the source, folks.
Xander Bogaerts has 42 for the Red Sox.
Okay.
And JD Martinez for the Red Sox has 41.
All right. And do you happen to have how many games would that be over? Right. So the Red Sox have played probably 30 games or something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what their
something in that neighborhood. So and it doesn't, and they both play for the Red Sox, which makes it a little bit easier. Mm-hmm. So if it's 30-ish and you go that 1.4, that's 42. They're right on pace for a 200 hit season.
Right, and that requires them.
JD Martinez is not going to get 200 hits. Bogaerts, maybe if he has a year, right?
He has his year,
right. I mean, that Devers got it in 2019 for Boston surprised me. I would have not guessed. And Whit Merrifield, when you think about it,
it's
maybe
less
he's
surprising
faster,
just because he's a really fast guy. So, I think that's also part of the problem is that because of how good the defenses are, you kind of have to be a fast guy because you have to be able to steal hits somewhere in the season. You have to be able to somehow get hits where otherwise you shouldn't be able to get them.
But I think it's obvious that the multitude of the 200 hit seasons happened years ago, and that was because striking out, in part, was a bigger issue particularly for good players. We all know the DiMaggio story of striking out 19 times in a season. If you struck out at the time, whereas today the strikeout is not nearly as thought of as a negative thing, so guys will do that without worrying about it. There was a pride, and so the power numbers went up and the strikeouts went up too.
I think it also has to just do with, if you think about it, strikeouts used to be so bad because just putting the ball in play was a pretty viable option because guys would make errors. Just they weren't as good defenders. They didn't have as much range. So just putting the ball in play a lot was a lot more valuable. Whereas now, unless you're pretty much getting a clean hit, you're not getting a hit. So it doesn't really matter if you're striking out or not.
I think there's evidence, strong evidence that says that, that the average routine play is made at a higher percentage rate today than it ever has in Major League Baseball. You hit a ground ball anywhere to shortstop, for the most part, you're out.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get too many comparatively the way that it used to be.
Right, where the guy's a little slow with the transfer and you beat it out, or you hit the seeing. You don't get as many seeing eye singles. You got to kind of rip the ball through the hole now.
Yeah, and basically what we advocate on this podcast is that players are going to have to make adjustments to hit the ball the other way, and you're maybe seeing it upon occasion, but the data doesn't back that up right now because we're still in the strikeout zone.
What it's going to take is a team pulling like a 2015 Royals, where they're like, you know what? All the other teams are just trying to hit the long ball. We're going to play small ball, work station to station, run a lot, hit and run. Some team is going to have to go, okay, you know what? Forget the power. Just hit it into the shift the opposite direction.
Yeah, as a team.
Because I think one guy doing it will be hard. It has to be a collective thing so that you can see the clear difference, because otherwise there's too much chance for variance that he tries to hit it the other way and the pitchers just don't give him a chance to.
If it were a few years ago, 5 years ago, I thought of Joe Madden as that kind of manager who would sort of take these outlier positions and try to go with it. And he's managing in Los Angeles now. And he is, got Trout, and he's got
Trout's hitting 385 this
season. So these guys are not going to be hitting the ball the other way.
That's also the problem, is that you have to convince your superstars to be like, no, don't hit the long ball.
Right. And can't you do it situationally, though? I mean, there is a time to come up and say, I need a jack here. Let's try to take the ball out of the ballpark, given the circumstance. Isn't there also going to be equal amount of times, or maybe more, where I can say, you know what, just poking the ball the other way where they're not playing me? And you're seeing teams
start to do that.
Start to shift. I saw against Alonso, after he started hitting the ball into right center, the game the other night, they had the guys positioned in right center. They were not playing the shift on him the way they normally would, because he had started to take advantage of hitting it where they...
And so you'll see teams get forced out of the shift because hitters are going to adjust. I think that what's going to be is you're going to have the issue of what are hitters going to be more stubborn on? Hitting it, like adjusting to the shift, or like trying to just keep doing what they're doing. It's going to be on them to be like, no, this makes sense for me. And so at first it might be a strategic thing, and then all you have to do is do it enough where they're like, well, we really can't afford to just give up a freebie base hit here.
One of the earlier abstracts I read in Bill James was about David Ortiz, and David Ortiz, who they said if he only had bunted to the left side against the shift, because he played against the shift for a good part of his career, that would have raised his average like a significant amount, simply because the defense would have had to play him differently, not necessarily having to hit it down there.
Yeah, you don't need
just the threat of it.
To use a bad basketball analogy as Knick fans, it's like with Elfrid Payton and him hitting threes. Like if he could just show that he could occasionally do it,
you actually would have to guard him out there.
You would actually have to guard him out there. So all the hitters don't need to hit into the shift every time. They just need to show they're good enough as a threat to do it, where you have to make a real tactical choice as a team to say, are we comfortable just giving up a base hit here in order to make sure he doesn't try and drive the ball into his power alleys?
I get maybe I'm naive. I'm sure I am. But the idea that when you sit down for your contract with the team and you say, okay, well, I had 207 hits last year. That's nice. No,
right.
I had 35 homers last year,
Okay. Yeah.
And that's just wrong.
But it's also but from a player perspective, it's also much easier.
Sure. Because
think about it, if you have to be a 50 home run guy, you're going to do it in 10% of your at bats.
Yeah. You're if you're that player, you're Andrew Jones.
Right. You had a lot of money if you're Andrew Jones.
Yeah, he got a lot of money, and he is a, as we call him, a true almost guy. You might even be over the top, at that because of his defense.
He's the kind of guy that I was saying, if the Baseball Hall of Fame wasn't so weirdly restrictive, he should be in there.
But let's look at the guys that had these kinds of great careers, and I'm trying to think of an example of somebody who, just because the power numbers are lacking, but they have everything else. Yeah, I guess so. I guess he's. I don't know if he would consider to be a Hall of Famer,
but he's the type of guy that was not appreciated because he didn't hit for true power. Now, part of it is that home runs are just sexy, like they're fun. ball go far, yay. But like, so I think that's part of the problem. Secondly, it's not easy to get that many hits. It's way harder to get 200 hits. You can't just be a 300 hitter like we've talked about. You got to be like a 330 hitter.
But it's harder now than it used to be, clearly.
Right. So I think it's also somewhat of a path of least resistance thing. It's a lot easier to increase your power, get stronger, and try and drive the ball out of the park.
Hit the ball over the damn shift.
Yeah. Then it doesn't matter. You could, like, there were...
Get that one back.
I was
in the
listening
seats.
to the radio with Spilbar, and they were talking about how, like, Manny Machado, the third baseman, caught, like, a line drive down the right field line to rob somebody of a hit. Like, what are you supposed to do about that?
That in the box score, folks, that goes L5.
Yeah, and you're just like, what? Why is Manny Machado halfway between the infield and the outfield down the right field line fielding a baseball? Like,
yeah, and in the game last night that the Mets played, one of the results of the shift is you had Jeff McNeil, who is a somewhat new second baseman, if you will, playing with Lindor, who's an all-star shortstop, getting in his way. Did McNeil on a ball that was hit to the left side of second base, where both McNeil and Lindor were, by the way,
and it was awkward.
And so Lindor ended up having to try to throw the ball to first base to get the guy on what would be a routine ground ball, not hitting McNeil in the face with the baseball because he was standing right in front of him.
I'm surprised there haven't been more defensive miscues, but at the same time, because there's so many guys in those areas, you have to hit the ball in a very particular place to cause that kind of thing to happen.
And exactly, and it takes, look, it's just so much about this game, and old time fans that hate the idea that everything is analytical, right? We're going to basically do things on the basis of what's working more and what's working less.
Math will guide us,
right? And the shift is just one of those things that the evidence obviously has not come out strongly enough that hitting the ball against the shift the other way and not going for the home run is going to overall deliver a better baseball player performance.
I think it's also got to be hard for batters to have that mental switch where some at bats you're trying to come up and drive the ball and you're trying to really focus on bat speed, launch angle, exit velocity. And then you would have to come up sometimes and be like, okay, all of that stuff, we're putting that to the side. I'm just going to try and hit it the other way.
And I've still got Smoltz, Glavine, and Maddox saying chicks dig the long ball in my mind, thinking that was one of the greatest ploys in history.
Not even that. What you got is your agent in your ear telling you hit 40 home runs this year. You're getting a lot of money. You're getting a lot of money.
I can get you the money.
And so you will be like, you know what? Let me go for it.
Yeah, and I just don't...
You don't think Michael Conforto's thinking he gets a much bigger extension this offseason if he can hit 40 home runs as opposed to he hits 320 and drives the ball the other way a whole bunch?
I'm not going to put it together with start a thing. So let's say you had a guy, he hit 231, 41 homers, 109 RBIs. Is that a great season? He had an OBA of on-base percentage of, 320.
The problem is, in a vacuum, no. On the right team, that might be valuable depending on what is...
For the team itself in that context.
But for a player, no. I would much rather have a guy that hit 300, 15 to 20 home runs and drove in 80.
Like Whit Merrifield.
I would much rather have Whit Merrifield than Joey Gallo.
Yeah.
But that's in a pure vacuum because I don't know what else is around my team. Because you know what? Having a Joey Gallo on your team, if you need that power, is valuable because unlike any other play in baseball, the guy just puts the wood to the bat and you score runs.
Right. And just fans don't really value it. In fact, the fact that we have to go back and look to see who's had 200 hits, it's something that we don't value enough. And granted, we talk more about ops and ops plus and all those advanced stats that help us understand the true nature of a player's performance. But 200 hits is still a pretty good barometer of something good happening on the baseball field.
Right. It's like the same thing as 3,000 hits in your career. You can't really compile to get there.
Well, you just got to have 15 straight seasons of 200 hits.
Yeah, that's super easy for everybody out there. That's the thing. So I think that's where it comes down to is that it's also hits in of themselves aren't sexy. So like having the guy that just a bunch of singles, like there's only been $100,000 singles player.
Right. Well, no, he was the first.
He was the first. But there's not a lot of them. Well, there's a lot of guys that have made millions of dollars because they hit
and we've got Major League Baseball doing all this wacky stuff, right? Which I actually personally am in favor of testing. Want to test weird ideas? Do it in the minor leagues.
Yeah.
You want to have a home run derby in the Pioneer League? You can do that.
You know what? Unrelated to that, good on the Mets organization and Cohen for finally letting the minor league affiliate use their spring training facility in Florida. Totally unrelated to this, but man, the Wilpons sucked.
So, I think that these 200 hit seasons are going to be hopefully reevaluated and thinking that this is a more important thing than we have been giving it credit for. And the shift is right there for us to say we can have people do this. All they need to do, as you said, is make the mental shift.
So what I think you're going to see is a team, because it's going to take a while. I don't think it's going to be a quick shift. Some team that's doing badly right now is going to think that way. They're going to do what the Royals did and go, okay, we don't have the money to compete to sign all the biggest home run guys. How are we going to compete? Well, what if we just played it differently than everybody else? What if we went out and got all collectively? Now, the problem is, if you have a bunch of guys capable of hitting the ball the other way, they're just not going to play the shift against you.
And it's funny, you took the words right out of my mouth, so I'm thinking the problem, I guess, will be that you're still facing guys throwing 95 to 100 most of the time, and you think it's easy to say, okay, this time I'm going to just serve it out the left field. This time I'm going to pull it down the right field line. It's not that easy.
So I think that's the problem, is it's not something you can turn, like stylistically you can turn on and off as much.
It's approach, though.
It's approach, but I think it's the kind of thing that needs to be a team-wide approach. One individual doing it, I think it's too hard for him to replicate that on a daily basis.
And the players, so I'm a big believer in Major League Baseball town. These players can do it. They're that good that they can make these adjustments. They're just, I don't know. I don't want to, it's not being lazy. It's the wrong word I want to use. They're not getting paid for it. I think it's just,
and I don't blame them. I'm sorry. If I knew I could make a lot more money by hitting the ball over the fence, I would totally do it.
So and when you're frustrated by a thing like the shift, and you're thinking, well, it's not easy for me to hit the ball the other way. It's much easier for me to try to get launch angle and hit the ball over the fence.
That's my normal swing. That's where I drive the ball, and I know if I just do it right, I'm locked in. I'm going to drive the ball over everybody. Doesn't matter.
So maybe I'll hit 24 home runs instead of 16, but I'm going to hit
260 instead of 280.
Yeah, right. And I'll have 180 hits or 170 hits instead of 200 hits.
Yeah, and I also have an extra $10 million.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.